Let's start with the scene. It is just after 10 on a Tuesday night in November, and the results from Michigan's precincts are coming in faster than the networks anticipated. The Detroit numbers are not performing the way the models said they would. Wayne County's turnout is down from 2024 in the specific communities that Abdul El-Sayed needed to run up the score. And in the rural counties, the counties that registered Democratic for 3 generations and voted Republican for the last decade, the numbers are not just bad. They are catastrophic. By 1047, Mike Rogers is ahead by 4 points with 63% of the expected vote counted. By 11:15, the Associated Press calls it Michigan, Republican, for the first time since 1994, for the first time in 32 years. The state that Democrats built their Senate majority on, that they counted in their baseline when they did the math on every competitive cycle, that they included in the safe column even when everything else was uncertain, has flipped. And the man who won it is the same man who came within a third of a point of winning it 2 years ago against a far stronger opponent. But here is the detail that is going to define how this night gets remembered. Mike Rogers did not win Michigan because the national environment shifted, because Trump turnout overwhelmed Democratic infrastructure, because outside money flooded the state in the final weeks. Mike Rogers won Michigan because Democratic voters in Michigan decided that the candidate their progressive base selected in a primary was not the candidate they were willing to elect in a general election. And the coalition fractures that were visible on primary night, the rural voters who broke for the establishment candidate, the black voters in Detroit who split away from the nominee, the suburban moderates who looked at the ballot and chose the retired FBI agent and Army veteran over the Democratic socialist. Those fractures did not close between June and November. They widened. Stick around. Because what happened in Michigan tonight is not a Republican story. It is a Democratic story. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why a party that holds the White House almost never loses a Senate seat it has held for 32 years, and why what happened tonight in Michigan is the exception that proves that rule in the most painful way possible. If you want this analysis the night it happens, smash that like button right now. Every click pushes this breakdown in front of every voter who deserves to understand what actually happened tonight and why. Now, before I walk you through the specific numbers that broke this race, you need to understand the structural reality of Michigan's Senate history. Because the 32-year number is not just a round figure that makes good copy. It tells you something specific about what Democrats built in this state and why building it took so long. Michigan has not sent a Republican to the United States Senate since Spencer Abraham won in 1994 during the Gingrich Revolution wave. Abraham served 1 term, lost in 2000, and the seat has been Democratic ever since. That is not an accident of geography or demographics. It is the product of a specific coalition, built across multiple cycles, that combined organized labor in the auto industry corridor, black voter turnout concentrated in Detroit and Flint, and college-educated suburban voters around Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids who trended reliably left on social issues. That coalition produced Senate victories in 2000, 2006, 2012, 2018, and 2024. It held in years when Michigan was trending Republican at the presidential level. It held when Trump won Michigan's electoral votes in 2016. It held when Republicans made gains in the state legislature. The Senate seat was the last structural Democratic stronghold in a state that has been trending competitive at every other level for a decade. And it held because the candidates Democrats ran for that seat understood the specific balance required to hold it. They ran candidates who could speak to the labor tradition of the industrial corridor, who did not alienate the Detroit base, and who did not scare the suburban moderates whose votes made the margins survivable in difficult years. Abdul El-Sayed did not understand that balance, or he understood it and calculated that the progressive coalition he was building was large enough to win without it. He was wrong. Here is a piece of electoral history that almost nobody covering tonight's result is providing. Because what happened in Michigan tonight has a direct precedent that Democrats had in front of them when they made the choices that produced this outcome. And the fact that they had the precedent and made the choices anyway is the part of this story that should keep every Democratic strategist up for the rest of this decade. Go back to 2010, Nevada. Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, was in the most vulnerable position of his political career. The Republican wave of that cycle was real and severe. And Nevada Republicans nominated Sharon Angle, a candidate whose positions on Social Security privatization, her comments about what she called Second Amendment remedies, and her general ideological profile made her, in any normal electoral environment, far too extreme to win a Senate seat in a competitive state. Reid survived. He won by 5 points in a year when Democrats lost 63 House seats. He won because the Republican primary had produced a nominee whose weaknesses with moderate voters were severe enough that a vulnerable incumbent could survive a wave by consolidating the opposition to that nominee. That dynamic, what political scientists call candidate quality effects, is a documented and reproducible feature of Senate elections. When a party nominates a candidate whose ideological profile is significantly out of step with the general electorate of a state, that party absorbs a penalty that can exceed the structural advantage of a wave environment. And the penalty is paid not just by the candidate who loses, but by every downstream race that depends on that candidate's turnout operation to survive. Democrats had this data. They had Nevada 2010. They had Missouri 2012, when Todd Akin's comments cost Republicans a Senate seat they should have won easily. They had Georgia 2022, when Herschel Walker's profile produced an outcome that the partisan math of the state should not have allowed. They knew that candidate quality effects are real and severe in Senate elections. They nominated Abdul El-Sayed anyway. Now let me walk you through the specific numbers that explain tonight's result. Because the aggregate outcome, Rogers wins Michigan by 4 points, obscures the specific coalition fractures that produced it. And the specific fractures matter more than the margin for understanding what this result means for the Democratic Party beyond Michigan. El-Sayed's primary result was the first warning. He won a two-person primary by less than 1 percentage point. He could not break 50% of his own party's vote. In a closed primary where only registered Democrats are voting, a Democratic nominee who wins by less than 1 point against a single opponent is a nominee who has just demonstrated that approximately half of his own party's primary electorate had reservations significant enough to vote against him. That is not a close primary. That is a structural preview of a coalition problem that will be far more severe in a general election, where independents and crossover Republicans are part of the electorate. The rural county numbers from primary night were the second warning. The precincts that voted for Haley Stevens in the primary, Michigan's rural communities, the counties that have been registering Democratic for 3 generations while voting Republican in presidential elections, broke away from El-Sayed at rates that were not compatible with winning a statewide general election. Rural voters made up approximately 19% of Michigan's population in the 2024 cycle, but accounted for roughly 40% of the increase in overall turnout that cycle. They voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And in the Democratic primary, they voted overwhelmingly for the establishment candidate, not for the Democratic Socialist. The Detroit numbers were the third warning. Black voters in Wayne County, who deliver the margins that make Democratic Senate victories possible in Michigan, split away from El-Sayed in the primary at rates that had not been seen in a Michigan Democratic primary in the modern era. A coalition that depends on overwhelming black voter turnout in Detroit cannot absorb a split in that community in a primary and expect it to close before November. None of those warnings closed. They compounded. And when the general election numbers came in tonight, every fracture that was visible on primary night was visible again, scaled to a general election electorate where the margin for error is measured in fractions of a point. Now here is the part of tonight's result that the national coverage is going to miss entirely because it requires connecting 2 stories that appear to be about different things. The first story is the Michigan Senate race. That story ends tonight with Mike Rogers winning by 4 points in a state Democrats have held for 32 years. The second story is the Democratic Party's internal civil war between the establishment wing and the progressive DSA-aligned movement that has been producing nominees across the country in cycle after cycle. Zohran Mamdani in New York. The DSA sweeps in congressional primaries from Maine to California. The progressive nominees in Oregon and Pennsylvania. And Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan. Put those 2 stories on the table together, and the picture becomes unmistakable. The Democratic Socialists of America have built a primary infrastructure capable of producing nominees in states and districts where the general electorate is not prepared to elect them. They win primaries because primary electorates skew younger, more ideological, and more urban. They lose general elections because general electorates include rural voters, black voters who are more moderate than the DSA base assumes, and suburban moderates who have been drifting right on cost of living and crime issues. James Carville said this in plain language months before tonight. Bill Maher said it. John Fetterman said it. The institutional Democratic Party knew that El-Sayed's profile made Michigan competitive in a way that a different nominee would not have. They spent more than $80 million in the primary trying to prevent this outcome. The $80 million did not prevent it. El-Sayed won the primary by less than a point. And tonight, the general electorate of Michigan delivered the verdict that the primary electorate could not. The Democratic Party just lost a 32-year Senate seat, not because Republicans were stronger than usual, but because Democrats nominated a candidate that a specific faction of their coalition demanded, and that the broader general electorate of a purple state was not prepared to elect. Their own voters did it. The primary voters who chose El-Sayed over the establishment candidate. The rural Democratic voters who could not bring themselves to turn out for a Democratic socialist. The black voters in Detroit whose enthusiasm did not match the levels the turnout models required, and the suburban moderates who looked at the ballot and made a different choice than they had made in every Michigan Senate election since 2000. Now let me give you the honest ledger. Because tonight's result has a Republican reading and a Democratic reading, and both of them are real. The Republican reading. Michigan proves the electoral map is shifting in ways that are not reversible through better communication or more campaign spending. The rural realignment is complete. The Democratic coalition in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania is structurally weaker than it was in 2018 and 2020. And a party that is losing rural voters permanently while simultaneously nominating candidates that alienate its moderate suburban wing is a party whose Senate map is contracting rather than expanding. The Democratic reading. Michigan was a candidate quality problem, not a structural problem. A different nominee, one who did not carry El-Sayed's specific vulnerabilities with rural voters and black voters, would have held this seat in the same environment. The structural coalition that produced Democratic Senate victories in Michigan from 2000 through 2024 did not disappear tonight. It was not assembled in a configuration that could win with this specific nominee. Both readings are partially correct, and the fight between them is going to define the Democratic Party's strategic choices for the next two cycles. Because if the Republican reading is correct, the party needs to moderate its positioning in rural states regardless of who the nominee is. And if the Democratic reading is correct, the party needs to reform its primary process to prevent progressive nominees from winning primaries in states where they cannot win general elections. Neither of those adjustments is politically easy. The progressive wing that produced El-Sayed's nomination is not going to accept structural primary reforms that limit its ability to produce nominees. And the rural voters who left the Democratic coalition are not going to return on the strength of policy moderation alone when cultural and identity signals are doing as much work in their voting decisions as economic ones. 3 takeaways. And the last one is the reason I am looking at tonight's result with genuine uncertainty about what it means for the next cycle rather than certainty about what it proves. 1. Michigan's 32-year Democratic hold on the Senate is over. That is a structural fact that does not reverse in one cycle. Rogers won tonight. He will be the incumbent senator from Michigan in 2032. An incumbency advantage is real and durable. The Democrats who want to reclaim this seat will be doing it against an incumbent, not in an open race. 2. The candidate quality problem in Democratic primaries is now a documented electoral liability, not a theoretical concern. $80 million could not prevent El-Sayed's nomination. The nomination produced the predictable general election outcome. And the DSA's primary infrastructure, which delivered this result, is not going away between now and 2028. 3. What happened in Michigan tonight does not necessarily scale to every competitive Senate race in the country. The specific combination of El-Sayed's profile, Michigan's demographic mix, and the rural realignment that has been building for a decade produced a specific outcome in a specific state. Nevada's Senate race, Pennsylvania's Senate race, Arizona's Senate race, each of those has different dynamics, different nominees, and different coalition compositions. Tonight's Michigan result is the most important single data point of the 2026 cycle. It is not the final word on every race in the country. Here is what I want you to take away from tonight. Democrats just lost a Senate seat they have held for 32 years. They lost it not because Republicans ran an exceptional candidate, though Rogers is a strong candidate. They lost it not because the national environment was overwhelmingly Republican. They lost it because the specific candidate their progressive primary electorate chose was the specific candidate their general election coalition was not prepared to elect. The argument is no longer about whether the Democratic coalition in states like Michigan is under stress. Tonight puts that on the board. The argument now is whether the party's internal dynamics, the primary structure, the relationship between the DSA wing and the institutional wing, and the specific policy choices that flow from whichever faction controls the nomination process are compatible with holding the Senate seats that have been the foundation of Democratic majority control for 2 decades. So here is my question. Is Michigan a one-cycle candidate quality problem that can be fixed with a different nominee in 2032? Or is it the beginning of a structural realignment that makes the Democratic Senate majority impossible to rebuild regardless of who they run? Drop your answer in the comments right now and tell me what state you were watching tonight from November. I read every single one, and do not stop here. The full returns from Nevada, Montana, and Arizona are still coming in. And each of those results, read alongside Michigan, tells a different part of the same story about where the Democratic Senate coalition actually stands after tonight. Subscribe and hit the bell right now and click the next video on your screen, because the November 3rd results are going to reshape the 2028 map before the morning comes, and you are going to want the breakdown as each state calls.